All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Andrew Gardner, and I'm the project director of the Making Baptist History Public History Project, which is an initiative of the Baptist History and Heritage Society. I'm joined this evening by the executive director of the society, John Finley. And we are so grateful this evening to be virtually hosted, our webinar virtually hosted by Ravensworth Baptist Church in Annandale, Virginia, and the Reverend Leah Grunset Davis. And so we're so grateful to see Ravensworth people in attendance today, and thank you so much for advertising this event and attending. Tonight's webinar will feature a discussion of the book Between Dixie and Zion, Southern Baptists in Palestine Before Israel. We will be featuring you can see a copy of the book right there from Allison. We'll feature a lecture this evening from the book's author, Dr. Walker Robbins, who serves as a lecturer in the School of Liberal Arts at Merrimack College. And we'll also hear a pastoral response and reflection from the Reverend Dr. Allison Tanner, who serves as the pastor of public witness at Lakeshore Avenue Baptist Church in Oakland, California. Following Reverend Dr. Tanner's response, we'll have roughly 20 minutes for question and answers. If you haven't gotten a copy of Dr. Robbins's work yet, I would direct you to the University of Alabama Press's website, and you can use the code I'm entering into the chat right now, Dixie Zion F22, and get 40% off that book. This promotion will run for the next few weeks, so if you like what you hear, you can go ahead and get a copy after the event tonight. Lastly, before I turn things over to Walker, I want to thank and acknowledge that this project is generously funded by the American Historical Association in collaboration with the National Endowment for the Humanities. And any findings, views, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this webinar do not necessarily represent those of the American Historical Association, the National Endowment for the Humanities, or the Baptist History and Heritage Society. But we do hope that these webinars will promote the study of history among the wider public, as well as promote historical thinking in our communities. And so with that, I would remind you to please keep yourself muted throughout the program until we get to the question and answer period. And with that, I will turn it over to Walker.
All right, let me get my screen share going. And all right, are we full screen for everybody? That sounds good. Well, first off, I want to thank Andrew and John for putting this on. I think this is a really awesome idea and a really cool series. I want to thank Leah and the Ravensworth congregation for hosting. Very happy to have you all in here, and those beyond Ravensworth who are tuning in as well. And of course, I want to thank Allison too. I really look forward to hearing your responses to the book and to the presentation here. Now, in getting into it, I think the best place to start is actually where I start in the book, and that's May 14th, 1948. So this is an important date in the history of the Holy Land and the history of Palestine because it was the last day of British rule in Palestine. The British had ruled the region since World War I. And for reasons that I'll talk about here in a minute that I'll circle back to, in 1947 had decided they didn't want to be there anymore. They wanted out. And so had put the issue of what should happen to Palestine before the newly formed United Nations. And the UN had voted in November of 1947 to partition Palestine between an Arab state, a Jewish state, and to have Jerusalem come under a kind of international administration. Now, this was a really big victory for the Zionist movement, which had been working to build the basis for a Jewish state in Palestine over the last few decades. It was devastating to Palestine's Arab majority, who were opposed to the partition plan altogether. And over the next few months, between this vote in November of 1947 and that last day, May 14th, 1948, civil war had broken out on the ground in Palestine as Jewish forces worked to secure the territory allotted to the Jewish state under the partition plan, and as Arab forces moved to try to thwart the implementation of partition, and as the British are trying to slide away from the scene. And as you can see here, May 14th is that day. It is the last day of British rule in Palestine. And it's in this context, it's amidst civil war, that on that day, David Ben-Gurion, who was the leader of the Zionist movement, proclaimed that at the midnight expiration of British rule in Palestine, that the state of Israel would come into being. So midnight rolls around, 11 minutes after midnight, 6:11 p.m. Washington, D.C. time, the United States became the first country to extend recognition to the provisional government of the state of Israel. And here you can see the official statement of recognition. The signature on it, of course, belonged to U.S. President Harry S. Truman, who happened to be a Southern Baptist. Now, a few days later, other Southern Baptists, many of them delegates or messengers, I should be more precise, from across the South and beyond, gathered in Memphis, Tennessee, for the Southern Baptist Convention's 1948 annual meeting. And I do realize my slide here is of the 1950 annual meeting in Chicago. This was the closest that I could find, but you get the idea. It's the SBC annual meeting in 1948 in Memphis. And at this annual meeting, a resolution was proposed that the convention send a congratulatory telegram to President Truman for his role in the creation of the state of Israel. Now, you might be surprised to hear that this resolution was repeatedly and overwhelmingly voted down. They even tweaked the wording a few times, addressed it to the UN rather than President Truman, addressed it to the state of Israel itself, but it kept getting voted down. The Southern Baptist Convention wasn't going to be congratulating anyone on the establishment of the Jewish state. Now, this is pretty surprising from the perspective of 2022. We've gotten quite used to, over the last several decades, white evangelicals comprising, the largest pro-Israel constituency in the United States. We've gotten used to the Southern Baptist Convention itself passing a number of resolutions along those lines, expressing various forms of support for the state of Israel. And so it's kind of weird that in 1948, at this moment of Israel's birth, this Southern Baptist Convention couldn't even muster the votes to just send a little congratulatory telegram to the president, who himself was a Southern Baptist. It's a very different context. Again, it's strange from our perspective. And really, with the book Between Dixie and Zion, what I'm trying to do is understand that different context, to try to recapture and recreate what was the Southern Baptist conversation surrounding Palestine in those decades leading up to the decisive year of 1948. Now, before getting into what I found in terms of what that conversation was, I think it might be helpful to do a little bit of background in terms of what was happening on the ground in Palestine during these years that we refer to as the Mandate era, when you're speaking from the perspective of the history of Palestine, okay? And roughly it's the time period spanning World War I until 1948. So I just want to give a little bit of background of that, and then we'll circle back to our Southern Baptist here. So on the eve of World War I, for the previous 4 centuries, Palestine had been a part of the Ottoman Empire. And on the ground in Palestine, the population was divided between an Arab majority. Majority of the Arabs were Muslim. You had a significant Arab Christian minority as well, mainly Orthodox Christians and some Catholics. And you had a significant Jewish minority that was concentrated in a few specific cities, most especially Jerusalem. You also had, in the years leading up to World War I, the Zionist movement had begun to become more organized, really from the 1890s onward. The movement had originated in Europe. It was seeking to solve the problem of anti-Semitism through the establishment of a Jewish community and eventually a Jewish state in Palestine. And you'd had an initial trickle. The movement is still very much concentrated in headquarters, and its headquarters were in Europe. But you had an initial trickle of Zionist settlements from the 1880s onward, a few Zionist communities on the ground in Ottoman Palestine. Now, 1914, World War I breaks out and changes everything. The British and the Ottoman Empire find themselves on opposing sides. And over the course of the war, the British would end up conquering much of the Ottoman Empire from the Ottomans, including Palestine. And here you can see an image of British forces moving into Jerusalem in December of 1917. Now, between World War I and 1948, the British would rule Palestine under what was known as a League of Nations mandate. Now, what a mandate, oh, and by the way, that's the reason we call this the Mandate era. It's the reason we refer to Palestine during this time period as Mandatory Palestine. Now, what a mandate was, it was kind of this quasi-colonial arrangement that had been developed by the Allied powers after World War I, as they tried to figure out what to do with like former German colonies in the former Ottoman territories that they'd come into possession of. And basically the idea was that each of these areas would be given a ruling power that would guide that particular country and guide its peoples towards eventual self-government, sort of like tutelage for self-government. It was a quasi-colonial relationship in reality. In many instances, it was a quite colonial relationship. But what was distinct about the British mandate for Palestine is that written into it was a promise that the British government had made to leaders of the Zionist movement during the war that was known as the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration had pledged the British government's support for the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. Now, you might be thinking that's some vague terminology, and it was vague on purpose. That's in part what diplomacy can be all about. And so whatever it was supposed to mean, in actual practice, what it means is that for the next several years, several decades, the British were going to coordinate with the Zionist leadership. We're going to facilitate the purchase of land in Palestine by Jewish national organizations, and perhaps most importantly, would facilitate Jewish immigration into Palestine. And all of this, of course, the Arab majority in Palestine objected to as an imposition, essentially by force. Now, here you can see, just get a general sense of the pattern of Jewish immigration into Palestine, and really what was on the ground a pretty changing demography, a really rapidly changing demography. The trickle of Jewish immigration into Palestine, it's not very substantial in the 1920s, but by the time you get into the 1930s, you start to see a significant uptick in Jewish immigration into Palestine. This is absolutely related to the escalating persecutions of Jews in Europe and European Jewish refugees seeking to find refuge. So there you can see the peak of this immigration comes in 1935. It's not an accident that it's the following year that you have a major revolt of the Arab population against British rule and against the Zionists. This revolt would last for about 3 years. The British moved to harshly and brutally put this down with military force. Even as they did so, though, in 1939, with World War II coming on the horizon, they decided to walk back some of their promises, some of the promises of the Balfour Declaration. And so the British, from that point forward, imposed pretty significant restrictions on Jewish land purchases and immigration into Palestine. And what this is going to result in, as World War II was coming to an end, is a Jewish revolt against British rule in Palestine. And it's this Jewish revolt that most immediately will prompt the British to kick the issue to the United Nations and set off the partition plan and lead to that series of events that I started talking about, 1947 and 1948, the establishment of Israel and the war that would surround it. So this, in a very tiny nutshell, is what we call the Mandate era. And all throughout it, so this is the background for Between Dixie and Zion, and all throughout the Mandate era, this question, the question of what should happen to Palestine? Should the Arab majority be allowed to govern itself? Should some sort of accommodation be made for Zionism? Should there be some sort of compromise between these two competing interests? This was referred to as the Palestine question. And so my starting point in doing the research for this book was trying to get a sense of what Southern Baptists had to say about the Palestine question during these really, really crucial years. And what I found once I started digging into the sources is that most Southern Baptists, really didn't prioritize the Palestine question as a political question. There wasn't a widespread sense that Southern Baptists did or should have a particular perspective on the Palestine question or on Zionism or on the aims of the Arab population. And that's in contrast, right, to today, where, Baptist individuals think all sorts of different things about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example. But if you refer to like what Southern Baptists tend to think about Israel, certain assumptions come to mind. And that absolutely was not the case in this pre-1948 era. What I found instead is that Southern Baptists had a number of different priorities that shaped the ways in which they thought and in which they wrote about Palestine, about the land, about the people, and about the politics of the region. And so what I ended up doing is focusing my research on these different priorities, on the different ways in which Southern Baptists were encountering Palestine during these decades. And so if you dig into the book, you'll see it's divided chapter by chapter along the lines of these different encounters. So there's a focus on travelers. There are several chapters on missionaries. There's a chapter on premillennialists who are interpreting the Bible and looking at events in Palestine through that lens. There's a chapter on editorialists in Baptist papers, and there's even a chapter on Harry Truman himself. But to give you a sense, so it'd be a bit involved to walk through all of those different groups, but I want to give you a sense of this kind of diversity. And so I think the best way to do that is to actually look at Baptist missionaries during this time period, because even though missionaries are going to share a certain number of priorities in terms of trying to advance the gospel in Palestine or in relationship to Palestine, you can still really get a sense of how different specific priorities and ways of encountering Palestine shaped often pretty different attitudes towards the Palestine question and towards Zionism. So what I want to do here is walk through 4 different missionaries that all wrote about Zionism through the lens of their different missionary work, to just give you a sense of the broader diversity that Between Dixie and Zion kind of touches on. All right. So first up is the first Southern Baptist missionary to Palestine. This guy, Shukri Musa, the guy with the lovely mustache, who was actually an Arab from Palestine. He was born in Safed to a Christian family. He'd actually converted to Protestant Christianity when he married his wife, Munira. In 1908, he decided to set off for the United States to try to see if he could create some economic opportunity for himself and his family. And what he ended up doing is he arrived in Texas and began peddling Holy Land souvenirs. And peddling was a common source of income for Arab immigrants from the Ottoman Empire during this point in time. Now, as he was peddling, he encountered some really important Texas Baptists. And I know we have a few Texas Baptists in here, so I can go ahead and name these individuals. George Truett, who was the pastor of First Baptist Church of Dallas, towering figure, later president of the SBC. L.R. Scarborough, who would be the first president of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He happened to run into them, and they guided him to convert to Baptist Christianity. And after doing so, Musa decided that he wanted to return to his homeland and start to build a Baptist mission there. And so he did. He returns in 1910. He starts to convert members of his family, beginning with his wife, Munira, and they relocated to Nazareth in 1911 to start to build their mission. They got going a little bit, then World War I broke out. This kind of threw things into chaos. Of course, Palestine was a field of battle during World War I. Musa himself was drafted into the Ottoman military. But after World War I, they're able to get their footing. They're able to slowly but steadily begin to build this mission and this Baptist community in Nazareth. It's also after World War I that the SBC's Foreign Mission Board took over financial responsibility for the mission, which is something that Shukri Musa had wanted from the get-go. And so Musa for several years was the Southern Baptist Convention's most direct connection to what was going on in Palestine. And he does become something of a spokesman for the region as a mission field and just as a region in general, although to a somewhat limited extent. So he is writing letters back to Baptist leaders. He is publishing the odd article here and there in convention-wide magazines and in the Baptist Standard, which is the Texas Baptist paper. Not a huge number of articles, but his voice was, circulating. And if you look at Shukri Musa's articles that he was writing about Palestine, if you look at his letters, one of the things that you find is that he is talking about Zionism, and he is actually warning Southern Baptists about Zionism in a variety of different ways. So, for example, he was warning Baptist leaders back home that the Zionists were purchasing land around Nazareth. He warns Baptist leaders with the Foreign Mission Board that Zionists were interested in possibly establishing a school near Nazareth. One of his most direct criticisms of Zionists, he actually published in the Baptist Standard. This is from an article in 1922. This was him condemning the irreligiosity of the Zionists, the secular Zionists. I noticed that these new Jews, or at least the majority of them, are irreligious people. They do not believe in the Bible as the ancient Jews, and we do. He's referring to the existing Jewish community in Palestine. They do not recognize the Sabbath. They eat any kind of meat. They are very rarely seen in the synagogue. They are immoral. They are very proud. Their noses are very high up, thinking that they are coming to be kings over the inhabitants. They have a great hatred to Christianity and to Christians. So pretty sharp words for the Zionist movement there. It's important to understand, though, and again, this is a big emphasis in the book, that in the context of these things, of these warnings that he's raising about Zionism, Musa was not really trying to build, for example, Baptist political support for the Arab cause. If you actually look into the context of these articles and the things that he was saying about Zionism, what he's really trying to do is light a fire amongst Southern Baptists and to help get them to extend material support for the mission. So, for example, when he's writing to the Foreign Mission Board saying, look out, the Zionists are buying land, it's not because he's expressing the broader Arab concerns about Zionist land purchases, which definitely were pervasive in Palestine at the time, but it's because he's trying to say to the Foreign Mission Board, prices for land are going up. So if we want to buy land for a church, we need to buy right now. The same for his warning about a Zionist school. This is part of his case to say that, look, if we want to build a school here, we need to make a move, because otherwise our children are going to end up going to a secular Zionist school. And you don't want that to happen, do you? And even this passage here from the Baptist Standard, which just seems to be such an obvious and direct criticism of Zionism, he articulates as part of a case for the Foreign Mission Board to send more money for more workers to expand the work amongst smaller Arab villages in the Galilee. And part of what he's saying here is he's saying that you have these secular Zionists that are arriving. They are opposed to Christianity. We need to make sure that the gospel is being defended in the area in which Jesus grew up. And so it's really crucial. It's an example of how, these what can seem at first glance as like general statements on the Palestine question as a political question, they really need to be interpreted in the context in which they're entering the conversation within the Southern Baptist Convention. And here it's primarily about fundraising and building support for this new mission. Now, Musa would remain the head of the Palestine mission in Nazareth until he died in 1928. Even before then, though, pretty early in the 1920s, he started to be crowded out as the main spokesman for the mission itself and for Palestine as a mission field. And that's because as part of the effort, as part of the Foreign Mission Board taking over financial responsibility for the mission, one of the things the FMB wanted to do was to expand the work and to start send American missionaries to expand it and to supervise it. And so once American missionaries start arriving in 1921, they really start to become the primary spokespeople for the Baptist, for what comes to be called the Near East Baptist Mission, the Baptist mission in Palestine. So what I want to do now is take a look at two of those American missionaries. They start arriving with some consistency, like I said, at the beginning of the 1920s, but I want to look at two figures from a little bit later in our time period. The first is this guy, Leo Edelman. So Leo Edelman arrived in 1936 in Palestine. He would be there until 1939. If those dates ring a bell for you from earlier in this talk, those dates roughly coincide with the Arab Revolt. So he didn't pick a great time to show up and start to try to expand the mission work in Palestine. But he is there, and he becomes an important spokesperson for Palestine as a mission field. And one of the things that he has to say about Zionism when he's writing Baptist Back Home is he is actually initially very enthusiastic about it, and about it potentially offering an opening for Southern Baptist missionaries who were seeking to reach Jews for Christ. And this hope was something that was shared by most of the Southern Baptist missionaries that began to arrive starting in the 1920s. Those who were working amongst Palestine's Jewish population tended to share in this hope because of a key component of Zionist ideology as it developed around the turn of the 20th century and into the early 20th century. And that was that, part of a core tenet of Zionism was the idea that Jewishness should be defined in terms of nationhood rather than religious identity. And so missionaries really seized onto that and argued that, well, okay, if Jewishness is a matter of national identity rather than religion, then it should not be a problem for Jews to convert to Christianity, that Jews could convert to Christianity and still maintain their Jewish national identity, even as they're embracing Christianity as their new faith. And so missionaries like Edelman, they're very, very hopeful about that, the idea of detaching Jewish identity from religion. And they think and expect that it might create this kind of missionary opening. What they end up finding, though, not quite. The Zionists weren't necessarily on board with that sort of thing. And what Edelman finds pretty quickly, only months after arriving in Palestine, is that his hopes that Zionism might make Jews more open to the gospel message were not to be realized. And in fact, that most Zionists that he spoke to about the issue pushed back against his message in the name of Zionism. And this really started to frustrate him. And you can hear his frustrations pretty early. Again, it's within months of him arriving on the ground in Palestine. This is from a circular letter that he sent back to supporters of the mission back home. They suspect us of wanting them to forsake their nation, he means the Zionists, when we want them to become believers in Christ. And they fail to realize that a man can be Jewish by blood and Christian by faith, the same as a man can be American by nationality and Christian by faith. He's essentially saying, they don't get it. We're not asking them to abandon their Jewishness. They should be fine with converting to Christianity, and yet they're saying that they're not. And so this becomes a real source of frustration for Edelman. And his perspective on Zionism really starts to change as a result of it. And you can trace in his writings, really from this point forward, that he's sending back while he's in Palestine through 1939, and even after he returns to the States. So during the World War II years and throughout the 1940s, Edelman, even though he's not a missionary on the ground, he still is one of the foremost spokespeople for the mission field. You can just trace his attitude towards Zionism. He goes from believing it could be a complement to the mission, that it could serve the interest of the mission and the interest of Christ as he understood it, to believing that Zionism was in opposition to the aims of the mission. And so he grows increasingly suspicious and increasingly critical of the Zionist movement, and actually privately grows quite critical of the Zionist movement. He would actually in 1949, the year after the establishment of Israel, send a letter to President Truman basically saying, you can't trust these Zionists. They're going to align with the Soviet Union, avoid supporting them if at all possible. And he writes this in like all caps. That sort of perspective he didn't make available to the Baptist public, at least that I have seen. But you can already detect, even when he's not going that far, in his writings in the Commission, so the main Southern Baptist missionary magazine, or in other Baptist periodicals, his growing suspicion of Zionism as existing in opposition to the aims of the mission. A very different perspective, at least a man who ends up with a very different perspective, is this guy, Robert Lindsay, who you might recognize the guy standing next to him. That's Billy Graham, who was visiting Israel in the late 1950s. Lindsay had served as his interpreter. Robert Lindsay, he had in many ways a similar background to Leo Edelman. They both trained at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. They were both relatively young. And they shared a lot of the same optimism about what, at least that Edelman had initially, about what Zionism might mean for the Baptist mission in Palestine. Lindsay had first come to Palestine in 1938, where he learned Hebrew at the Hebrew University. He'd met Edelman then, but he didn't return as a missionary himself until the mid-1940s, until after World War II. And you can see from his writings, again, that he shares this hope that Zionism, being a form of Jewish nationalism, might create a sort of opening. This is from an article that he wrote on the eve of setting out to Palestine to serve as a missionary. The forms of the old faith are not holding the Jewish people. And with the Zionistic national definition of the Jews has come the real possibility that a strong Jewish loyalty to Christ may develop. So he's echoing those kinds of hopes. Lindsay, of course, he'll run into the same issue that Edelman ran into, right? Resistance to his message. But he's going to react to it very, very differently. In part, this is a matter of temperament. In part, it was because Lindsay himself came to very, very deeply identify with the Zionist movement. He was actively inspired by it. And so what he is actually going to call for is for Baptists to adapt their mission to Zionist forms. And so this takes different forms. So one of his projects, he was this great Hebrew scholar. He starts to develop a vocabulary that missionaries could use to kind of change the way in which Christians talked about aspects of Christianity in the Hebrew language. He wants to make it friendlier to Israeli, later on, ears. He calls for really renewing Christian faith in light of its Jewish roots. He believes that in this newly developed Zionist community and eventually the state of Israel, that Christianity could really be renewed by being infused or reminded of the Jewish roots of the faith. Another example, he advocates one of his main projects when he first arrives in Palestine is the purchase of a tract of land in a town called Petach Tikva that he hopes will serve as a type of Baptist kibbutz. Kibbutzim were these socialistic agricultural settlements that the Zionists had pioneered. It doesn't quite develop into that. It becomes more of a campground for Baptists over the ensuing decades. But it reflects this idea that Lindsay has that Zionism is not something that exists in opposition to the mission. It's something that the mission needs to adapt itself to. And so that's going to guide the way that he talks about Zionism when he's writing back to Southern Baptists back home. It's going to affect the way that he conducts his leadership within the mission. And it becomes a big part of the mission for decades moving forward. Lindsay is going to be there in Jerusalem, pastoring the Baptist congregation there until the late 1970s, if not 1980s. And so between Edelman and Lindsay, you have these two individuals that have the same interests, right? They want to advance this Baptist mission in Palestine. They have a similar background. They have a similar theological perspective when they're getting started. And yet they end up coming to very, very different places in terms of their understanding of Zionism. Now, the last missionary that I want to talk about was not a missionary in Palestine, but is a missionary who talked a lot about Palestine. And that's this guy, Jacob Gartenhaus, who between 1921 and 1949 was the Southern Baptist Convention's only missionary to the Jews of the American South. He was the only guy employed by the Home Mission Board to evangelize the South's Jews. Gartenhaus himself was a Jewish convert to Christianity. He identified as a Hebrew Christian, which meant that while he embraced the Christian faith, he maintained something of his Jewish identity. So he's like the kind of Christian that Edelman had hoped to find in Palestine or to bring along in Palestine. He was also a dispensationalist, a premillennial dispensationalist. So his interpretation of the Bible, he believed that the covenantal promises between God and the people of Israel were still active, that Jews remained God's chosen people, that Palestine remained their promised land. And he believed that these covenantal promises would be fulfilled in concert with the second coming of Christ. And so that perspective is going to be really important for Gartenhaus. It's informing the way that he thinks about his own identity as a Hebrew Christian. It informs the way that he thinks about Zionism, and it's going to inform the message that he shares with Southern Baptists in his 28 years as a missionary. Now, one thing that's important about Gartenhaus's mission is because he was just this one guy, he actually ends up prioritizing outreach to individual Baptist congregations rather than necessarily going and try to evangelize as many Jews as possible himself. What he tries to do is travel around the South and build up support at the local level for individual Baptist congregations to evangelize their community's Jews. And so what he ends up actually doing over those almost 3 decades is he's spending way more time talking to other Baptists than talking to potential Jewish converts. And in doing so, he becomes really the leading Baptist spokesperson on issues relating to Jews and Judaism, and this includes Zionism. His first book that he published with the convention, his first full-length book, was actually a primer on Zionism itself. It was called Rebirth of a Nation. It came out in 1937, and this is what he had to say: Zionism is going to win whether anybody likes it or not. To oppose it is to oppose God's plan. This perspective, this was related to his interpretation of the Bible. It was also related to his identity as a Hebrew Christian. And he also made this case in the context of his very specific mission. Because part of what Gartenhaus was trying to do as he went from congregation to congregation, as he spoke to different Baptist associations and state conventions, was to convince Southern Baptists that evangelizing Jews was important, to convince them that they need to participate in this work. And a big part of his case was that the Jewish people are still important to God. And in making that case, he pointed to Palestine, he pointed to Zionism and what it was achieving on the ground as evidence that God still cared about the Jewish people, and so should you, in seeking to evangelize your community's Jews. And so even though Gartenhaus, his perspective on Zionism is informed by a bunch of these other factors, in terms of how he's presenting it to Southern Baptists, it too is very much tied to his specific priorities as a missionary, trying to get people on board to support Jewish evangelism. And that's actually the broader point of the book, Rebirth of a Nation. It does offer a very positive depiction of Zionism overall, but it also says Zionism isn't enough. The Jewish people need Christ, and so Southern Baptists need to get involved. And so these are 4 different missionaries we've walked through: Shukri Musa, Leo Edelman, Robert Lindsay, and Jacob Gartenhaus. They all share the interest of the missionary in trying to build and advance the cause of their particular mission. And in doing so, touch on the issue of Zionism and come to pretty different conclusions about it. And all of these different conclusions, by the way, they're being kicked around and published in all these different Baptist periodicals. And so these missionaries are reflective of this broader diversity that you see within the SBC during these years. There are different kinds of encounters. There are different priorities that Baptist travelers have from Baptist editorialists and that sort of thing. And that all shapes the way that they're talking about the Palestine question, that they're talking about the Zionist movement, that they're talking about Arabs. And so understanding them really requires getting a sense of these individual contexts. Now, the flip side of this, the other thing that I was trying to figure out with this book, of course, is, all right, so on the one hand, we have this context where you don't have, a widespread sense of a single Southern Baptist perspective on the Palestine question. Well, how do we get eventually to that relatively widespread support? Do we see any of the roots of that already during the Mandate era? And I do think we see some of the roots of that during this time period. And I want to point to a few things that I think helped contribute to long-term the development of that relatively broad Baptist support for the state of Israel. One is perhaps an obvious point, which is that even though you didn't have a widespread sense that Southern Baptists should feel a certain way about the Zionist movement or the Palestine question, you did have individual Southern Baptists, both within and at the fringes of the convention, that did think that way, that did make the case that Southern Baptists should be, at least in a general sense, supportive of the Zionist movement. Gardner is one example of that, right? So he's going around and he's saying this is part of God's plan for history. And he's saying that for 28 years. That's going to have an impact, right? Another example you can see up here, this is Myrtle Kreisman, who I think is sneakily one of the more important Southern Baptists of the early 20th century. Myrtle Kreisman was the program editor for Royal Service, which was the periodical of the Women's Missionary Union. And part of her task as program editor, so one of the tasks of the WMU, of course, is mission study. Is helping to educate Southern Baptists on the different mission fields and missions that the convention supports. And Royal Service is a big tool in that. It was this monthly magazine. There's still a version of it, but it's a monthly magazine where you have lesson plans, basically providing information about these different mission fields, letting Baptists know some details about what's happening in Chile or Brazil or Italy or Palestine. And so Kreisman, between the mid-1920s and the late 1940s, she's the program editor. She writes a bunch of different programming in Royal Service during that time period related to Palestine. And she herself, she followed Gartenhaus. She was a premillennialist. She believed Zionism was part of God's plan for history. And so when she's writing about Palestine as a mission field, those perspectives are brought in. She brings in that perspective. And so those ideas would begin to be distributed throughout the convention through Royal Service. And so like through examples of Gartenhaus and Kreisman, you can see these are two figures who are particularly well positioned to shape the ways Southern Baptists might think about what was happening in Palestine. And they are very, very supportive of the Zionist movement. Another factor, and this is one that I really hit home in the book, is that irrespective of any particular Southern Baptist's actual political views on the Palestine question, religious perspective, kind of no matter the different type of encounter, one thing that's almost universal in Southern Baptist writings on Palestine is that Southern Baptists tended to identify the Zionist movement with Western civilization and modernity and material progress, in contrast that with the Arabs, whom they viewed as backward or quaint at best. This is true of premillennialists. It's true of people who are opposed to premillennialism. It's true of people who supported Zionism, as you might expect, but it's also true of many Baptists who were opposed to Zionism or who were sympathetic to the Arab cause. It's just a universal way that really almost all Southern Baptists that I encountered who were writing about Palestine viewed what was happening between Jews and Arabs on the ground. And to get a sense of this, this is a quote from Z.T. Cody. This is from a report. He traveled to Palestine as part of a tour of different Baptist mission sites in 1920. These Jews are bringing with them a far higher civilization than they find in Palestine and a better religion. They buy the large tracts of land they occupy and turn them from a waste into a garden. Wherever you find a Jewish colony, and you find many here and there, you find a little patch of our Western civilization set up here in the dead and dirty East. And that last line really, very straightforwardly captures what's implied in, again, source after source after source dealing with Palestine during this time period. These kinds of ideas, that sense that there is a global divide between a civilized West and a backwards East. In academia, we tend to refer to that as Orientalism. And Orientalism is really pervading everything that Baptists had to say about Palestine during these years. And it's not just Baptists, by the way. It's not unique to Baptists at all. This is broadly spread in American culture and Western culture more generally. What's interesting here, though, is that it did not necessarily translate, like I said, into political support for Zionism. So Z.T. Cody himself, even as he's saying this, like the Zionists are part of the West, extending into the dead and dirty East, elsewhere in the article, he expresses a lot of sympathy with the cause of the Arabs, and he says it's perfectly legitimate that they would push back against Zionism. So these attitudes did not on their own translate into political support for Zionism. However, I do think they play an important role because they provide a kind of a second language, in addition to the language of the Bible, that those Southern Baptists and those non-Southern Baptists who were supportive of Zionism could draw on in making the case that Southern Baptists should be supportive of the movement. And so you do have the likes of Jacob Gartenhouse making that sort of case. You do have the likes of Myrtle Kreisman making that sort of case. The figure that I argue in the book is most effectively makes that kind of case is this guy, J. Frank Norris, who our Texans in attendance will probably know pretty well. Norris was a notorious figure within the Southern Baptist Convention in the first part of the 20th century. He was the pastor of First Baptist Church, Fort Worth. He was he aligned himself with the fundamentalist movement that was developing among Northern Baptists in the 19-teens and the 1920s. And he actually led a fundamentalist revolt against the SBC in the 1920s. Because of that, he got kicked out of the Southern Baptist Convention in that decade. He also ran into some legal trouble when he shot and killed a man in his office at First Baptist Church, Fort Worth. He was acquitted of murder and maintained his pastorate there. Norris, for those reasons, he's a very controversial figure within the Southern Baptist Convention, but he also remains a very important and influential figure, pushing on the convention from the outside. You had a number of Southern Baptists who remained loyal to the convention that still liked what Frank Norris was doing. He's very influential in Oklahoma and Texas in particular. And Norris, more than anyone else in the study, has the characteristics of what we would, kind of call a Christian Zionist today. He's a dispensationalist, so he argues that Zionism is the fulfillment of prophecy, that it's part of God's plan for history. He takes that sense that the Zionists and Arabs are on opposing sides of a civilizational divide, and he absolutely inflames it and says this is a civilizational clash. And so he's arguing from the 19-teens into the 1940s that God and civilization basically demand that Baptists, that good Christians, align in support of the Zionist movement. What really sets him apart, though, is that by the end of the 1940s, he actually gets to be a bit more activist, right? In a more of a political direction. He starts to build relationships with Jewish organizations, and he starts to, in a somewhat halting way, start to stake out a public political pose, trying to put pressure on President Truman to support the partition plan, to support the recognition of Israel, to support Israel once you have the war unfolding that accompanied its establishment. And in building those relationships and in starting to organize politically, he really is something of a forerunner of the evangelical Christian Zionism that becomes more prominent later. Now, to bring this all back full circle, I'm basically filling out my full time here. It was actually Norris who was behind that 1948 resolution that was presented at the Southern Baptist Convention annual meeting. He was not allowed in these annual meetings, but he held a counter convention that year at the Peabody Hotel in Memphis, which is the hotel where they have the trained ducks, if you've ever been to Memphis. And he had this big public address on Palestine where he called on President Truman to support Israel, and he called on the SBC to pass this kind of resolution congratulating President Truman. And it's one of his allies within the meeting that actually forwarded that resolution that got repeatedly and overwhelmingly voted down. And so one of the reasons for it being voted down, as has been persuasively argued by the scholar Terry Lindley in the Baptist History and Heritage Journal, is in part that it was associated with this rabble-rouser, J. Frank Norris. So even though that vote failed, though, his influence would continue to be felt for many decades moving forward. And it's just another example of really what is a key point in this book. If we're trying to understand what Southern Baptists are thinking about Palestine during this time period, it's really important to recapture these different contexts. And so that, I think, is about it.
Great. Thank you so much, Walker. This is fascinating. I will now turn this over to Allison. So we can go to Gardner.
Okay. Yes. Thank you so much. I learned a lot more even in that presentation from the book, and you illustrate really well the main theme of one of the main themes of the book, that historically there have been multiple Baptist narratives on Palestine. And that was true in the past, and it's still true today, although perhaps today it's just as good a well-kept secret as it was in the past that you've been able to break open for us. May the multiple narratives on Palestine among Baptists be ever more fully heard. And that's where we come in, and we have our role to play, our voice to use, and our message to share loudly. And if you didn't know where I was coming from, that lets you know right there. Thanks for having me here. I really appreciated both reading the book and really being pushed to say, what does this history of Baptists mean for, or shed light on, for Baptists who continue to think about the Palestine question, who continue to seek to respond to what historically has been called the Palestine question. And so in giving us some ways to think about this, I wanted to lift up a few of the main themes that I found in the book and how I find them insightful. One of the main themes that Walker lifts up is that how one encounters Palestine shapes what they think about the region. And likewise, the frames that are being used to interpret what they encounter were foundational. Not a new idea to many of you, but how does this get unpacked? Walker talks about three main frames that Southern Baptists have. The mission field. People who encountered Palestine through the mission field were really focused on saving souls. And we saw through these multiple missionaries how they really weren't looking politically or less so politically than this frame of the mission field. One of the other frames that the missionaries frequently had was that of pilgrimage, that of encountering Palestine as a holy land, but as a spiritual land. And so when they think of Palestine, again, they don't think of it in political terms, they think of it in spiritual terms. They think of what is the individual spirituality, that spiritual experience that I can have going to this place. And then the third frame that was lifted up in the book is the frame of biblical prophecy, or the frame of what has and will happen in Palestine is divinely controlled. And that can be seen in very different ways, premillennial, postmillennial, but one of the frames is that there is a divine plan, or there ought to be a divine plan for what happens here. What happens in this land will represent an earthly kingdom of God in some way, one way or another. So these three frames, mission field, pilgrimage, and biblical prophecy, really help shape how Baptists were thinking about Palestine. And so I thought I would share my own Baptist frame for Palestine, which is that when I went to Palestine 5 years ago for the first time, I went not with a group of Baptists. I was the only Baptist. I didn't even go with a group of Christians. I went with a group of activists. We were activists who were challenging the US-Mexico border wall, and we went to talk to Palestinians who've been challenging the Israeli apartheid wall, the Israeli separation wall, depending on where your starting point is. But when I encountered Palestine, what I encountered was a holy struggle, a struggle for liberation. And so that affects how I've viewed and understand what's happening in Palestine. On my second trip, I encountered Palestinian liberation theologians, and I worshiped with Palestinian Christians, and I was able to see that they have a profound biblical and theological frame for understanding what's happening in Palestine, but it's not the mission field, it's not spiritual land, it's not divinely controlled biblical prophecy, it's liberation theology, that the God who was at work to release the Israelites from Egypt is at work releasing the oppressed peoples of the land from the Pharaoh of the land. So how we encounter Palestine shapes the way we think about the region. Some frames for today in the 21st century, we often hear Palestine shaped as a political struggle. Who gets to rule? Who gets statehood? Who gets self-determination? We often hear what's happening in Palestine from an economic lens, from the colonization of Britain to the colonization where the US uses Israel as its proxy in the Middle East. And we often hear about Palestine in frames of ideological struggles, with religion being the conduit of ideology. And yet here again, how you read the Bible shapes what truths are being lived out, because I would argue that there's a strong biblical argument for understanding Palestine in terms of liberation, in terms of a struggle for democracy, and in terms of struggles for justice. There's no one Baptist way of viewing Palestine, and I think that is still as true today as it was before. But I wonder how many people know this. And I wonder where the alternative Baptist voices outside of the Southern Baptists are being spoken, are being amplified, and are intentionally being silenced. And that's where I want to lift up throughout the book, just smatterings in most chapters, if not every chapter. There were voices of dissent. There were voices of critique, but those were smattered throughout, and of course the Baptist history of listening to voices of dissent is so important. And so even as there is a very dominant Southern Baptist narrative on Palestine and Israel right now, let's pay attention to voices of dissent. Let's pay attention to alternative positions and perspectives that may not be found in the Southern Baptists, but I sure hope can be found within Baptist circles in the United States. And then I did want to say a word about the power of the perspective from history. Christian Zionism is certainly now the dominant voice among Baptists. And I have to say Baptists because Southern Baptists are the largest manifestation of Baptists. And yet this book reminds us that Christian Zionism, though ubiquitous among Southern Baptists, was relatively recently created, or certainly created as the dominant narrative. And so likewise, it can be uncreated. And I shared this in other settings talking about Christian Zionism, but although it is widely held, it tends to be very shallowly held. There tend to be a lot of Christian Zionists who think, oh, God wants Israel, but why and but how? And as they understand more, as they learn more about what's happening on the ground, that tends to be a very shallow belief that can be undone. And so the work of prophetic justice and decrying the evil being done in the name of religion is so important. And that's something that the Alliance of Baptists have been doing, something that Ravensworth has been partnering in doing. So as we look at the fairly recent history the dominant paradigm, let's also remember that history can be undone, or history can continue to evolve, and that there's room for a larger Baptist voice, Baptist perspective, and Baptist work. The final thing I want to talk about is what Walker mentioned at the end, which is the role of Orientalism in blinding the Southern Baptists to injustices that were taking place in Palestine, and really the broader role of the power of racism in general to silence the need for justice. I was so intrigued that there were Southern Baptists who were anti-Zionist, yet pro-modernization, pro-Western civilization. There were folks who could see the injustices of what was happening to Palestinians, to the Arab world, and yet they weren't willing necessarily to fully challenge that. Much because the gospel in their minds wasn't really separated from Western civilization. The gospel often, in the minds of so many, can't be separated from or untangled from white supremacy. And so even though you have folks that can see injustice, they were silenced, or they were numbed to do anything about it. And I think that really says a lot about the ways in which white supremacy continues to function in our day in ways that we need to take a look at. And so if Frank Norris had two languages, two ways in which he viewed the world, the Bible and Orientalism, and if the dominant understanding of Christianity in the United States has the languages of the Bible and white supremacy, what are other languages that we can be using to not allow the racism that's pervasive in this country from silencing the work of justice? Is it possible, and I know this is aspirational, but is it possible that we could have the languages of Bible and justice, and that might be a way of countering the power of racism to silence the need for justice, even among Christians, Bible believers, Baptists. And so I think I'll pause there to open it up for some questions.
That's great. Thank you so much, Allison.
Let me just say thank you, Allison, as well.
Yeah, Walker, did you have a response before we open it?
Oh, no, I just wanted to thank you, Allison, on your feedback and on sharing your own encounter with the Palestinians.
Okay, great. So yeah, let's open it up for questions. Does anyone have a question? Feel free to raise your hand and I can, yeah, GJ.
Dr. Tanner, that was a beautiful description of Baptists and Palestine, and thank you for sharing that. It reflects a lot of our thinking. Walker, I have a very simple request, is that early on, to define Palestine and its people singularly might not be adequate. I would like for you to consider thinking about Palestinians based on their genetic makeup and their historic time within what we now call Palestine. For example, the Mizrahi Jews, they did not speak Hebrew except in their worship service. They spoke Arabic. So can we call them an Arab Jew? The other thing is that Christians, Muslims, and Jews even before the creation of Israel, all were genetically common. A lot of the DNA studies that have been done lately have shown a lot of similarities between Christians, Muslims, and Jews, the Mizrahi Jews and the Palestinian, whether they're Muslim or Christian. And during the history of the Palestine, the rulers dictated what religion people chose. During the Ottoman Empire, a lot of Christians converted to Islam. And during the Mandate period, a lot of Muslims converted to Christianity. So the religious definition is not adequate. We have to look at Palestinians based on their DNA. And I think that's really important. And when my father grew up in Palestine, he said everybody spoke Arabic, everybody played soccer, everybody ate Palestinian food. So I want you to consider that as I read that book, that foundational piece, I think, needed to be added. And if that piece is added about a better definition of who we're talking about, not just the history, not just the theology that Dr. Tanner spoke about earlier, but the people of the land. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, GJ. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you that the demography of Palestine, it doesn't fit into these neat kinds of categories, certainly the kinds of categories that you have to get into and quickly setting up this kind of lecture. And one thing that I think is important to kind of build off of your point is that even the categories of Arab and Jew that are so familiar to us, these are identities that are developing and changing on the ground really at the beginning of the 20th century. There's a great diversity in terms of peoplehood on the ground in Palestine. And these modern identities themselves, in the forms that we understand them, are a part of the story, like the development of them and people identifying one way or another and being slotted into these different categories. That is a big part of the story. And it reflects too, it's also something that you can see in the sources. So the first the first full chapter of the book, rather than the introduction, goes into, you know, how Southern Baptists were wrestling with Ottoman Palestine in a variety of different ways. And you can see they are uncertain on how to categorize different people, especially Arabs. They didn't know. Sometimes they prefer the term Syrian to describe local Arabs. Sometimes they preferred to distinguish between urban Arabs versus Bedouin. And there is some awareness of these different categories there that really hadn't taken full hold and are very much a product of the late 19th, early 20th century and the nationalisms that developed during that time period. So I think your point is a great one.
Thank you so much. Other questions?
So I have one, I'll defer certainly, but I did have a question for Walker.
Sure, go ahead, Allison.
When I think about the different frames that you put forth, you know, the missionary frame, the biblical prophecy frame, and the pilgrimage frame, I also wonder, and you mentioned it once or twice, but didn't really unpack it. So I'd be interested in your thought, the frame of exceptionalism. You know, if Southern Baptists had by and large an understanding of Christian exclusionism or of Christian exceptionalism, which is certainly what the missionaries have when they're trying to convert people, you know, to what extent does the role of exceptional, and certainly Western exceptionalism, you know, if you have any understanding of exceptionalism, be it religious, be it governmental, be it socioeconomic, be it a specific ethnic or racial group, then you're always going to be led to some type of hierarchy. And I was just wondering to what extent the frame of exceptionalism from an idea of Christian exceptionalism then gets translated into, certainly got translated into Western exceptionalism, but it didn't. And sometimes it got translated into a chosen people, but sometimes it didn't. And I was curious how those threads might have been running through some of your research.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because yeah, this does deal with one of the chapters, that early chapter that talks about some of the roots of this stuff. One of the things that really stuck out to me is that you do have this pretty big shift in terms of how Southern Baptists viewed the Jewish population in Palestine from before World War I to after World War I, where that population is becoming more Zionist. And like GJ was saying, a lot of the existing Jewish population in Palestine, Mizrahi Jews, Sephardi Jews, spoke Arabic, identified closely with the local culture in a variety of different ways, and the Zionists are very different in that regard. Prior to World War I, when you see Southern Baptists writing about the region, in terms of exceptionalism, there is a kind of Baptist exceptionalism in terms of how they viewed Native Christians in the area, right? As not being truly Christians, as being nominal Christians, as far as being Catholic or Orthodox. And so there isn't an identification with them on the basis of being Christians. There is a very clear Western exceptionalism, the belief that is what's needed or what's missing is all of the stuff that makes the West good, especially Christianity. And what ends up, what was very interesting to me is to just look at the way Baptist travelers, for example, were talking about Palestine prior to World War I as compared to after, is that with the arrival of the Zionists, that impression of, prior to World War I, they viewed Jews as part of this backward Easternness in general. And that really starts to shift after World War I with the arrival of the Zionists. As travelers are seeing them, they're seeing these settlements that look more Western, that look more European. They're seeing the streets in Tel Aviv are really wide as compared to the narrow streets of Jaffa and things of that sort. And so kind of through these postcard impressions, I call them, they kind of pull the Zionists into that sense of Western exceptionalism, which I think is an important, factor in those Orientalist attitudes that we talked about. So I think that's one way in which that really comes through there.
As I was reading some of this, I was reminded of how the Irish become white, how my ancestors were racialized as non-white, and how they went through a way of distancing themselves from non-whites to become seen as white. And I wondered if the Ashkenazi Jews in Israel had that type of, at least from a U.S. perspective, that type of transformation.
In terms of the Baptists themselves, it's really not necessarily anything that's driven through connections with Jews on the ground. It's really a vaguer sense just from traveling through, from working as missionaries and that sort of thing. So it's not something at that point that I would say is specifically cultivated in that way, although it has that exact effect, right?
We have a question in the chat from James. Walker, did you encounter any sources reflecting whether Zionism was on the radar for any Baptist professors of Old Testament or Hebrew in Southern Baptist seminaries during the Mandate era?
Yeah.
The presentation.
Yeah. Appreciate it, James. Absolutely. So J. McKee Adams, who was a biblical scholar at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, actually wrote, I initially had this in the presentation, but I knew I was going to butt up against my 50 minutes, so I pulled it out. But he wrote, in the middle of the 1930s, the Foreign Mission Board produced a series of mission study manuals on Palestine, and they're producing mission study manuals all over the place. And Adams, who was a biblical professor, produced the one on Palestine and Syria and Lebanon. And he actually is very supportive. It is probably the most overt and the lengthiest case amongst the stuff that the SBC produced for the Arab perspective in the conflict. And so he did not draw connections between his work as a biblical scholar and Zionism by any means. He was rather supportive of the Arab perspective. And actually you find at Southern, if there was kind of an anti-Zionist core within the SBC, it's definitely at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Three of the most prominent critics of Zionism and critics of Baptist support for the movement were Adams, were H.C. Gardner, and W.O. Carver, who were all professors at SBTS, and really pushed back against what they were seeing as increasing interest in dispensationalism, in premillennialism, and in Zionism, both for biblical interpretation reasons and broader political reasons.
Great. Other questions? I had one actually, just looking at the Jewish Christian missionary Garten House.
Mm-hmm.
I was really interested in the title of his book, Rebirth of a Nation. And, obviously drawing upon Birth of a Nation, this, movie that I'm assuming drawing upon it. I mean, there's very clearly, it seems to be a reference there to this movie that, kind of spurs the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the South. And so I'm really curious about that title and what the connection is to it, and if it made him more receptive in Southern Baptist congregations, if he's drawing upon that at all.
I don't know. I would doubt if that is a specific allusion to the film that Garten House was the one behind it, because he was, I didn't go into his full biography, an immigrant from Eastern Europe who arrived in the 19-teens when Birth of a Nation was coming out. And it is possible, this is a big American film. It's a blockbuster smash, in addition to being a horrifying racist depiction of Reconstruction. It's possible he imbibed that title or something. I don't think he's trying to draw any clear reference to it necessarily. I am curious, and I really hadn't thought of it, how that might resonate with Southerners in terms of his message.
Yeah, it makes me wonder if people were just more willing to pick it up because of, just hearing that. For Southerners in particular, I'm sure hearing that would be, a bell that would click in their heads.
Yeah.
Even if it wasn't clicking in, perhaps an immigrant's, mind when they were composing it. But
yeah, it might be the editors of the series might have thought, this has a nice ring.
Yeah.
There is a Klan connection that I uncovered in the book, which I share, which I find pretty entertaining. I actually published about this in the Baptist History and Heritage Journal. The first American missionary that was sent to be the superintendent of the Near East Baptist Mission in 1921 was a guy named W.A. Hamlet, who was an utter failure. He quit after a few weeks. He threw the mission into chaos. He had been the pastor of First Baptist Church, Austin, before being appointed as missionary. He comes back briefly, retains his pastorate in Austin, and then moves on to become a traveling speaker for the Ku Klux Klan, and actually the editor of the Courier, which was the Klan's national periodical, Courier with a K, of course. And he actually publishes, if you happen to stumble across some copies of the Courier from 1924, when he started editing it, he was the anonymous editor of the Courier. He's got all sorts of articles about Palestine that he took from a book that he'd written about it earlier.
Oh.
I think he went to Baylor, by the way.
Where I am right now, so got to look into that. Other questions people have? Yeah, Hussam. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Okay, well, my question is about today's evangelicals. Would you say it's less diverse in terms of there's look like consensus in terms of their support for not just in their religious beliefs that this is God's plan and dispensationalists go along those lines, not just in terms of political leaders that are evangelicals and representative at the various institutions in government, but also in terms of their activities to bring more Jews to Israel and do all kinds of activities. I see, or what do you see? It doesn't matter what I see. What do you see in terms of their, there is like very little challenge to them, except perhaps from some Catholics or theologians that may disagree with the role Israel plays in God's eternal plan. Probably liberation theology, activists, but those are very marginal, generally speaking, not as powerful as this evangelical power that you would see it influencing political leaders and political activities. I live in Oklahoma. I see political leaders who basically say, you know, this land given to us, to the Jews, God said so, that's the end of the story. So what do you see in terms of that, looking at the past, the way you addressed it, and in terms of today? It looks to me like there is a huge, tremendous consensus on the role Israel play, regardless to the end goal. They don't care very much about what would happen to non-evangelicals at the end, whether they are Muslims or Jews or any other things. Thanks.
Yeah, great question. I got to give a shout out, Hussam. I'm also an Okie, although I'm in Massachusetts currently. I'm from Oklahoma City. I think you're absolutely right. So this relates to something that Allison was saying, is that, you know, there is overwhelming, you know, amongst Southern Baptists in particular, white evangelicals, conservative evangelicals more broadly, yes, overwhelming, and by this point in time, very, very organized support for the state of Israel. There are, just like Allison was saying, other voices that don't have the same reach necessarily or impact at this point in time, but there certainly are, even amongst the evangelical community. Allison working in the Baptist community as well, people who do have different perspectives. And I think a big, you know, tool in developing that in the last few decades has been travel, has been building like actual connections and relationships with Arab evangelicals on the ground, in Bethlehem and in East Jerusalem, and in Nazareth. And so there are those voices there, but there is, you know, this huge din of voices in support of the state of Israel. And that really is, it's the product of decades of work to make it that way. The way that I tend to characterize it in talking about how Christian Zionism comes to be such a big force in general is that there are kind of three interrelated components. There are the ideas, which we've talked a little bit about, relating to the Bible, relating to Orientalism, and other things. There are these relationships that really start to develop. I mentioned that Frank Norris, he's starting to build some relationships with Jewish and Zionist organizations in the 1940s. You have other evangelicals that are doing the same, including Robert Lindsay later on in the state of Israel. He's facilitating connections between evangelical leaders and the Israeli government. And this leads to institution building. And that's something that we really start to see in the 1970s and the 1980s, Christian Zionist and you know, conservative evangelical political institutions really starting to be built and working to convince, like one of the things you can take away from the book, of course, is that Christian Zionism is not an inevitable byproduct of evangelical Protestantism, not by any means, right? You have authentically Baptist and evangelical figures that are on all different sides of this thing. But one of the things that the organized Christian Zionist movement has been able to do, and I think one of the best ways to understand it, is they're taking the case to Christians and trying to make the case that this is a natural and inevitable byproduct of evangelical Protestantism. They've had a lot of success in doing so. But I also think that those who want their church communities to be more attentive to the Palestinian plight and their cause have also learned some lessons from that in terms of how to use those same tools to push back in a way. But yeah, I think you're right in diagnosing the general scene, but I do think underneath there are some of these alternative voices. It is a different setting though, like pre-1948, there isn't a sense that there is a dominant voice at all. And you can really kind of speak freely about these issues in these different settings. And that does change in many ways over the next few decades.
Great. Thank you so much, Walker, for that response. Let's everyone thank Walker and Allison and Ravensworth for hosting this event. We can do our hands like this, you know, so we can do our thank yous. Again, please go out and get a copy of Between Dixie and Zion at the University of Alabama Press. Dixie Zion F22, as I mentioned in the chat earlier, you can get 40% off. If you haven't had your fill of Baptist history webinars, there is another one coming up on November 16th. I'm putting it in the chat right now. This will look at Dr. Robert Morovich's Peace Be Still, How James Cleveland and the Angelic Choir Created a Gospel Classic. And will be hosted at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Richmond, Virginia. So thank you everyone for a lovely evening. Thank you so much, Walker and Allison, and thank you everyone else for coming. See you next time. Have a good evening.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.